What a fucking masterpiece. Imagine a line. No, an artwork. Maybe this one, or this one, or this one here. Okay, comparing my channel art to the Italian Renaissance could be a bit of a stretch. Nonetheless, every stroke of an artist's brush is a choice. It's a conscious decision to fill a previously empty space with color. Except that color always leaves something behind, the unpainted, the emptiness. Some of it deliberate, but almost always all meaningful. Artists call it negative space. In Japanese culture, this empty space is called ma. Ma is a pause in time. Back to the line example, it's the moment the line gets interrupted before eventually resuming again. That step that involves resuming is important. Ma is an interval of emptiness, the conscious void, the choice to create deliberate stillness. What does Ma have to do with Fumito Ueda and his amazing creations, spanning across endless plains and imposing empty castles with ominous shades of darkness, which, as we hopefully all know, is the negative opposite of light? Well, who knows? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. When I was a kid, my gamer uncle kept talking to me about this one game. You could hold hands with a scared little girl trying to escape your captives in a world where most no words were uttered. Of course, I was just a stupid kid who just found out you can run over pedestrians in Vice City, so I wasn't too hooked. But then it happened again, and this time you could gallop through endless plains with a horse, defeat massive monsters, and be guided by a beam of sunlight bouncing off your weirdly angular sword. I didn't know what made it feel so special, but that time I knew this one was different. Maybe because I was a little older by then. Fumito Ueda's early games did that stuff. They made you question the entire design language of games at a time in history when the medium was aspiring to be closer to films than ever. You may have heard that the legendary designer behind Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, and The Last Guardian is often credited to be a pioneer of game design by subtraction, which is an elegant technique that most games still don't really employ nowadays, but that creates incredibly minimalist experiences when done right. But I think that label undersells a lot of who Fumito Ueda really is, and what drives him to make games the way he does. His story goes beyond design influences, embracing an entire approach to creativity that dare to inspire countless future generations of game designers and directors. And in this video today, we'll look at it all to help us answer a bit of an uncomfortable question. How did Ueda harness the same silence that most modern games shun so much? Well, cozy up around the fire, my friends, because we're in for a hell of a ride this time, learning about one of my personal favorite game designers in the entire history of video game development, who just so happens to have a new game coming down the line with his Triple I studio. I'm Anthony L. Wolf. Welcome to the Indie Diarist. I'll be honest, my mate here, Fumito Ueda, bit of a hard one to track down. Whatever little is known about him is scattered across a multitude of written and recorded interviews, some of which are almost lost to time and inaccessible without a trip down the Wayback Machine, which actually makes a lot of sense considering how invisible he keeps his hand in his games. But there's a bunch of really good articles that dive into his entire story and even his most recent views around game design, and it's gotta be one of the coolest stories I've ever read. Before he went on to make some of the best games in the PS2 generation, and then eventually found his own studio Gen Design, the Japanese video game designer grew up in the Kansai region, specifically in Tatsuno City in the Hyogo Prefecture. Now I say that as if I have any idea where that is, but I'm sure my future self will pull up a very cool map on screen right now. Ueda went to college in Osaka, lived there for 2 years, then moved to Tokyo, and all this time, his interest in the arts was brewing quite intensely. In fact, to say that young Ueda was in love with the art of drawing is a massive understatement. He would draw manga and comics in class as a child, creating portraits and caricatures of his friends, and would even make up stories to go along with them. You can tell he had the soul of a storyteller already, much like myself, scribbling letters on the floor of my room, except calling me a good writer is an insult to anyone who's ever published a book in history. At most, I can remove toppings from a pizza. However, there is one thing Ueda and I really do have in common. His ability to talk with girls was essentially non-existent in his younger years, and all he liked was watching a ton of movies and playing a ton of games. Not exactly what a young teenager girl with a celebrity crush for Robert Pattinson may be looking for in someone her age. Yeah, we'll take no further question on that one, thank you very much. He recalls that he already liked playing games, but his favorite pastime was actually catching fish with nets, and he sometimes would even make the nets himself. He played a lot of Famicom Disk System, loved Smash Ping Pong, but perhaps the most significant piece of lore is that he was really attracted to the art and graphics of Dragon Quest, which hinted at his designer nature already then. Somewhere down the line, he decided that he would do industrial arts and design in high school. That's where designer Ueda was born, and from there he knew he wanted to do something that had to do with design. And while pursuing abstract art in Osaka during college, he kept watching loads of films and exploring the beauty of art and design. But I'd lie if I told you that Ueda was anything close to an extremely talented student. In fact, by his own admission, he was a pretty awful one. He said he used to go out on long motorcycle drives for 36 hours during college, and he didn't really care much for learning at all. After graduation, he sold off his motorcycle and used those funds to buy an Amiga. That's where his passion for computers was born. Ueda realized he couldn't really make a living from drawing and the fine arts, I really wonder why, and so decided to do the only thing that made sense to him: work on creating things that he actually enjoyed doing in his spare time. I know, doing something you like in this economy? I joke around, but I like to be serious for a second. The more I read about Ueda and his years before adulthood, the more I recognize the pattern that many others will hopefully spot as well. Anyone who's felt like a bit of a misfit will empathize with Ueda's ambition to find his place in the world. It's something creative people have to come to terms with sooner or later. We're all unique in our own way, but perhaps that uniqueness is also what makes us lonely sometimes. You may call me biased, but I think very few people feel that loneliness more than creatives struggling with an early adulthood identity crisis. Sometimes our dreams don't really work out, and there really isn't much we can do about it. Call it a research error, if you may, but no interview I read or found seemed to touch on this point. Despite having friends that he could presumably rely on, Ueda often sounds like he may well know the definition of loneliness. And this will become even more apparent as we run through what came after graduation, in the unpredictable chain of events that led him to take a spot at none other than Sony Computer Entertainment, not long after he began his career in digital arts. Yeah, mate? Contrary to what you may think, Ueda didn't start working in games right away. His interest was in animation and computer graphics, partly fueled by his experiences with the Amiga. But with no mentor or teacher to show him the way, Ueda was completely self-taught in the art of computer graphics. This didn't exactly stop him, because after working for the regional Kansai television for a brief time, he sent something to a company called Warp, now a music publisher. They liked it so much, they hired him on the spot when he went for an interview. Ueda's application film was a computer graphics short film of a car driving through the rain. Couldn't find that one, but what allegedly impressed Warp was the care and attention to detail that he put into the minute elements of the film. According to Ueda, there were puddles, wheels that left a wake, and the rain looked convincing, revolutionary, I know, but that was enough to get him hired back in the 90s. I see AI bros do far more complicated crap with their planet-sucking video generation models today, and no one seems to be getting hired at big production companies now, are they? Anyway, Ueda was a full-on Amiga otaku by then, playing lots of games, working as a modern artist, and he had even submitted work to Sony's Art Artist Audition. Warp was also a new and exciting company at the time, with lots of work spread across its staff of 15 to 16 people. Apparently it was a fun company to work with, but that's not to say that they didn't work their asses off. Everyone was extremely dedicated, and Ueda said he had to push out 3 scenes a day. Even now, looking back, he periodically reminds himself that no matter how stressful things get, this isn't as bad as Warp. May everybody go ahead in life with the same energy. And after working at Warp for about a year and a half on some Enemy Zero and Shokutaku projects, then came the time for the big move, arranging an introduction with Sony Computer Entertainment. If you had to guess, what would you say is one reason a creative person like Fumito Ueda may want to leave his job? If you guessed lack of creative freedom, you're either a creative yourself or somehow gained access to my research notes before this video, in which case you can expect to hear from an attorney soon. But yes, Ueda felt like Warp didn't give him enough creative freedom to actually create the stuff he wanted, and so he decided to head for, Sony, like a big corporation. You may catch some subtle irony in that, but if you were around in the late 90s, you may remember that Sony wasn't that bad at all. It was known to be one of the most creatively adventurous publishers in the industry, putting out absolute gems like Parappa the Rapper and Intelligent Cube, two games which, coincidentally, were big sources of inspiration for Ueda himself. So he was right to make that call, for about a decade at least. And with something like this, Ueda managed to get an appointment to interview at Sony Computer Entertainment, and after one meeting, they basically asked him to go work with them straight away. Ueda was kinda hoping he would be able to work on his own film project before starting a new job, and so he asked for 3 months to wrap it up and then start working with them. But Sony wanted him so bad that to Ueda's surprise, they asked him to join them anyway and told him they would let him create the film he wanted while being employed at Sony. To a man who found a lot of influence in Rodney Allen Greenblatt, the amazing artist behind Parappa the Rapper, this was a dream come true. And so Ueda joined the team. Around the same time, the release date for Final Fantasy VII was announced. Given Final Fantasy VII was first released in 1996 and then released in January of the following year, this would place Ueda's first days at Sony around mid to late 1996. At this point, Ueda was practically a baby in games industry terms, and he was working next to giants such as the Polyphony team, which was deep into its 4th game at the time, a certain underspoken little gem called, Gran Turismo. It wasn't long before this environment, which was definitely stimulating, got Ueda excited about making his own thing. After the 3-month pilot film was finished, Sony immediately greenlit the development of Ico, which was originally heavily inspired by Ueda's film itself. Ueda and his team started making Ico in the image of the pilot movie with hardly any changes. He had a master planning document where he was outlining his ideas and especially his ambition to do a brand new kind of game, something unlike anything that had ever been made before. He wanted to make a game that featured AI, not the planet-sucking kind, that responded more directly to the player, not something mediated by the screen, a desire he would obviously carry forward until The Last Guardian as well. He also wanted to put a lot of style into Ico, with a big visual emphasis, wanting to express something like flashback or out of this world. Apparently he wasn't trying to be super artistic or edgy, but the style of Ico kinda came naturally to him. And yet the team was understandably microscopic for Ueda's first games, with 5 people at first, who eventually grew to 15 and then 20 towards the end. For comparison's sake, the team behind Legend of Dragoon had over 100 people working on the game. I know, different game, but of course, keeping to a specific vision is always going to be a little easier on a smaller team. So Team Ico had an advantage, but this is not to say that with fewer people, getting alignment on Team Ico was any easier. Remember, this was a computer graphics artist entering into the realm of game design and programming. He didn't come from a technical background, and he didn't think he could really compete in traditional gaming terms in the first place, like on Tekken or Virtua Fighter levels of technical detail. According to Ueda, there were some internal conflicts around action and enemies, for example, like how much action there should be, or how varied the enemies would need to be. And on top of that, there were some problems that the original PSX hardware just wasn't built to solve. Anyone who's ever laid their filthy hands on Ico will know the game was never about visuals and or imagery. So that wasn't the problem with the PS1. What the real problem was that Ueda really wanted for Yorda to behave exactly as intended. But this was near impossible on PS1's limited hardware. And while the end result of the game may have been minimalistic, early concept art showed that the planning behind the game was anything but. Ico was a conceptually complex game with simplicity at its core. Now that was a sentence. So when the PS2 hardware started becoming available internally, the team saw an opportunity to let Ico fulfill its real potential and reach Ueda's ambition. It meant that they'd have to start over, and Ueda was a bit hesitant, as a console's launch titles are hardly ever good, or so he thought, but the team was assigned a programmer who worked directly on the PS2 hardware. I imagine that helped a little bit. Meanwhile, the gaming world was starting to get excited about Ico. It was first revealed in 2000 and shown again the following year at E3 2001. RIP E3, by the way. The problem was, a game with so much silence wasn't exactly marketable at the time. Or perhaps it's more likely that Sony didn't really know how to handle such a sleeper hit. Remember, this was a game that was trying to be something that had never been done before. Ueda is often openly blamed his minimalistic approach for hurting the marketing of Ico. And when you look at the copies sold against the years it was in development for, you may think he has a point. The game sold only 700,000 copies by 2009, 8 years after its initial release on 6 December 2001. But we don't like grounding a game's value into copies sold around here, and in fact, the game was an enormous success among players and critics. Ico received an aggregated score of 90 out of 100 on Metacritic, and is often considered to be one of the greatest games of all time. But to Ueda, this success wasn't really apparent. Domestically, the game wasn't doing so well in Japan, and it wasn't until Ico began being nominated for awards that Ueda realized how big it was overseas. Even then, his initial response on the game's release was kind of blank. With what I could only define as huge clarity of mind, Ueda said, "When you spend so long making something, you can easily lose your objectivity. Any praise was far outweighed by the criticism in my mind. Oh, I should have done more of this, or how can we be releasing it in this state? Moreover, there was no one on the team to reassure me you made the right calls, Ueda. There was no one on the team to reassure me you made the right calls, Ueda." This is when I reached a turning point in my research. Even in a publisher as creative as Sony was at the time, and with a dedicated team of about 20 people, there was no one giving Ueda a bit of reassurance that he was calling the right shots. Now, I don't pretend to be some sort of expert of Japanese culture, so I don't know how much of this was because of circumstances versus the personal pride of a people stereotypically known for suppressing emotions in the workplace. But what I know from the basic personal experience of, being a human is this: depending on who you are, the noisier your brain is, the quieter you appear on the outside. It's a very lonely life, the one of a creative professional such as Ueda. Even worse if you find yourself in leadership. You may call it imposter syndrome, introversion, or a million other things, but this fact remains. There was a fundamental loneliness to Ueda's position that trickled into his entire approach to game design. Somehow, this allowed him to make some of the best games which have ever seen the light of day, including his next hit, Shadow of the Colossus. And development on Shadow of the Colossus started immediately after Ico, under the codename Nico, where Ni means two in Japanese, and Ico is just Ico. Very creative, I know. Except this time, Ueda didn't have anything on his plate, so he picked up a very old idea and ran with it. Once again, it all started with a film. A team made of Ueda and about 10 animators worked on a promotional video, and Ueda said one of the core concepts around the early development of the game was this feeling of massiveness and a sense of scale. It was also around this time that Ueda started thinking about a potential theme. He realized big bosses are generally a given in games, and through the production of the game, he stopped to think he was actually getting a lot of enjoyment out of killing these monsters. What if he flipped that concept around? Shadow of the Colossus is founded on the concept of cruelty, lying beneath the many layers of the game. But if Ueda were in the same room with me right now, he would probably slap me for implying that it was following a theme all along. In fact, Ueda finds clinging to a theme is far too inefficient when making a video game. His worlds are often generated out of technical or conceptual restrictions, emerging from functionality reasons rather than backstory settings. He strives for consistency and harmony in his creations, and through the production of Shadow of the Colossus, this really came through. It also sounds like he sometimes struggled to communicate with the team exactly what his precise intent was. Did you know that when he first showed them the sad music sequence at the end of a Colossus fight, the team thought it was a bug and started laughing? Ueda has always tried to defy expectations, and Shadow of the Colossus was his big chance to prove his vision had legs. He was also very level-headed about it. Western game journalists often asked him what he thought of GTA 3 given his stance on cruelty. I'll leave it with you to judge how ridiculous of a question that is. But Ueda simply responded that he actually enjoyed GTA 3, and with Shadow of the Colossus, what he wanted was to present his own take on the theme of cruelty and violence. Definitely a much smarter response than what those journalists were expecting, most likely. But now his views on game design were also starting to become more concrete and formed. He's never been a huge fan of taking control away from the player for a big exposition scene, preferring to let the context and the environment of his games speak for themselves. He predicted that in the future, games must get away from having cutscenes and allow for more player control during story sequences, a trend that we've seen a lot more since the PS4 era specifically. But for him, the biggest thing was that he wanted to see video games stand on par with other mediums of entertainment, allow them to develop their own languages and let players partake in that language however they saw fit, almost becoming linguists themselves. This quote I found is particularly powerful, and it's a really good way to think of Ueda's approach to game design. In any game development, you see there's going to be problems. Hardware limitations, not knowing how to present an idea. If you're too focused on a single goal or idea, it can be very difficult to build a game around it. But once you have more than one motivating idea, that's when the game starts to really come together. The irony of this sentence is not lost on me, because coincidentally, clinging to an idea was exactly what caused The Last Guardian to be delayed for so long. Hey there! If you're enjoying this video so far, maybe consider liking and subscribing. Every little support counts, especially if you cried like me at that scene in Shadow of the Colossus. Let's get back to it. The very few post-mortem interviews that Ueda released after The Last Guardian's release point to a seriously troubled time for the legendary designer and his team. Initially, Ueda's intent for Shadow of the Colossus was to create an emotional connection between Mono, the girl that Wander wants to save, and the Colossi the player needs to defeat. In reality, players connected with Wander's horse Agro a lot more. And this simple fact surprised Ueda so much that he decided to explore the concept in his next game. For The Last Guardian, the relationship between the protagonist and a non-human creature had to be at the center of the entire experience. That was an ambitious aim, and one that would soon come back to bite Ueda and his team. Trico's AI was a convergence of the team's previous pioneering work in Yorda's AI and the groundbreaking collisions in Shadow of the Colossus. But once again, just like with Ico, Ueda drove into a metaphorical technical wall quite quickly, and he realized the PS3 simply did not have the technical capabilities to fully fulfill his ambition. The game entered active development in 2007, but it was only released in 2016, 9 years later. Its development reflected a time of active turmoil, both within Sony as it grappled with the financial impact of a disastrous PS3 launch, and within Ueda himself, who publicly stated he was going through some internal crisis about a lot of things at the time. And in news that shocked everybody, Ueda and a number of other Team Ico employees, as well as some Sony employees, left Sony in December 2011, which slowed down the development of The Last Guardian massively. He founded his own studio, Gen Design, and was eventually rehired with his team as a freelancer to continue development on The Last Guardian, taking it to the finish line. He also remembers being conflicted about this choice. He had to choose between doing something entirely new and helping the Sony team deliver The Last Guardian to actually finish that project and then move on. Obviously, he chose the latter. Throughout this time, Ueda kept reminding himself and his team that making a game players wanted to play had to remain at the forefront of all their goals and ambitions, and that The Last Guardian needed to appeal to gamers experiencing it for the first time, rather than themselves as developers. This is something that came up a lot in many of Ueda's interviews, this commitment to players' fun, his respect for their needs and agency. This is to me the most evident mark of a great game designer. But after so many years and very little results, any publisher would have entirely scrapped the project and probably laid off the team. In fact, I have no trouble believing Sony would do that in the blink of an eye today. But Ueda was lucky. He had forged strong personal relationships within Sony, possibly thanks to his personality and vision as a designer. Shuhei Yoshida himself, who was president of Sony Interactive Entertainment from 2008 to 2019, stepped in to help. He loved Ueda and his approach to games, and so he took a creative bet that not many executives would even consider today. He decided that The Last Guardian would get published one way or another, no matter how long it would take, and kept encouraging the team to do its best. Sony finally released The Last Guardian in October 2016, after Sean Layden reintroduced the game the year before at E3 2015. I remember there was a collector's edition of the game, and I managed to get one at the time. I still have my little Trico statue somewhere in Italy. Maybe I'll bring it here to the UK one day. The Last Guardian gathered a cult following once again, but this time, people generally agreed that it was not as impactful as its predecessors, probably a result of the long development times and the internal crises within the team. Nevertheless, The Last Guardian still carries much of Ueda's identity and Team Ico's entire ethos, the contemplative beauty of silence, turning loneliness and being lost in a creative instrument of emergent experiences. Not many games today can say the same. Ueda's philosophy for design is seeped into many of the most creative studios in the industry, but a lot of AAA games are still clinging to the most cheap and relentless methods to try and extract engagement from players. Cluttered UIs, constant NPC chatter, visual stimuli, and dopamine farming, we see that all too often in games from big publishers that love our money more than they love the idea of us having fun. You may say that's genre dependent, or that there are exceptions, or that indies don't necessarily follow that rule, and that is true. This is the Indie Diarist after all, but it's a very nuanced topic that maybe requires a dedicated video in itself, so it's possible that I will work on that next. And I already know what games are on your mind. You'll cite Journey, God of War Ragnarok maybe, or Elden Ring, or even The Last of Us, for how they're all able to replace noise with silence and do it effectively. But here's the thing, there's one figure that consistently shows up across a lot of these studios. Hidetaka Miyazaki, founder from Software, said that he was working as an account manager at Oracle when he played Ico and awoke to the possibilities of the medium. He started making games because of that. A dear friend of mine, and if you're listening, hello sir, even told me that the Ico Castle is basically at the heart of Lordran's design, which I didn't remember, honestly. We have the Soul series and Elden Ring and all of the games in between because of Ico. Neil Druckmann, director of The Last of Us and Naughty Dog, has repeatedly called Ico his favorite game and said that he wanted the relationship between Joel and Ellie to feel as powerful as the one between Ico and Yorda. Genova Chen, from That Game Company, has noted that Ico and Shadow of the Colossus were the benchmark for what they wanted to achieve with Journey and Sky. And Cory Barlog, the director of God of War from 2018, you guessed it, has called Ueda's work storytelling in its purest form. It likely informed the more intimate focus of his latest games. And there's more. Joseph Fares from Hazelight Studios, the makers of Split Fiction, says their game Brothers was heavily influenced by Ueda's approach to game design. Even outside games, film director Guillermo del Toro champions Ueda's games as proof that video games are art. Hopefully you're starting to see the pattern here. A lot of the best games we play today are a result of Ueda wanting to make stuff no one had ever seen before. But making games that know how to use silence and loneliness is hard. More than anything, it's a risk and a financial liability. And as for those that never learn from Ueda and his masterpieces, especially for the corporate institutional fear that demands things be done a certain way, that's an issue for another day. So what's next for Fumito Ueda and his gen design team? In 2024, a short teaser showed a promising new project from Ueda that seemed to take a new creative direction on his most beloved themes. It was shown in collaboration with Epic Games as a sci-fi, possibly post-apocalyptic project with a small robot in a world of giants. We haven't heard much about this project since then, but given the partnership with Epic Games and Ueda's newfound creative freedom with gen design, here's hoping we will hear more about it soon. When you think about it, it is almost a full circle moment. The same reason that led Ueda to leave Warp, to find that creative freedom, seems to be what led him away from Sony as well. The more I hear about him and see him speak on video interviews, the more Ueda strikes me as a man who never quite knew where he fit, and somehow managed to find his place in an industry that valued his creative mind. And listen, maybe I'm projecting, but Fumito Ueda was able to turn his own loneliness into a weapon, a creative instrument to make experiences people and players will care to remember him by. And care about them he does too. Quite deeply, in fact. As development on The Last Guardian dragged on, Ueda no doubt felt incredibly guilty for having players wait so long. He apologized sincerely during an interview shortly after The Last Guardian's release, even though a lot of people were patient enough to wait, to be completely honest. But the thing I keep coming back to is that quote about no one ever telling him that he was doing the right thing on Ico. He trusted his guts, went with what his vision required, and despite his difficulties building some relationships in his younger years, He eventually found his place making things he can be proud of. Ueda harnessed the silence around him to expose his busy, contemplative mind to the world, making games that always try to defy the established norms of the medium, and making them unique, his own, and compelling. He put his own vulnerability on the table, lay his mind bare naked, and allowed us to listen in. That takes a lot of courage. But there's another side to him that isn't quite discussed as much. Many people try to assign meaning to Ueda in ways that he never confirmed to be true. In fact, I may just be doing the same with this very video right here. The truth is that Ueda never confirmed or said explicitly that any of these speculations around his character are true, including the use of ma that I mentioned in the beginning. There are no apparent records of him attributing subtractive design to himself. It's an industry term, a label that was born out of circumstances as we humans desperately tried to categorize things and himself to make sense of what we were seeing in our brains. But in reality, we may never know what led Ueda to do games the way he did. Nor may we ever know why he keeps doing them now, except for the only things he said by his own admission. That he wanted to create something no one had ever created. Because in his mind, there are always possibilities. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss the next one. You may also want to check out these past videos here. And if you want to support the channel in any way, you can find links to my Patreon and socials in the description. I'll see you next time.